The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany during World War II is one of the most controversial topics of the conflict. The controversy is twofold: moral and effectiveness. On the moral side, was it justified to attack and firebomb full cities that had no military value? Putting the moral question aside though, was the strategic air campaign an effective and efficient use of resources? Answering those two central questions will lead us to the ultimate goal of, was strategic bombing worth it? I'm sure some of you will disagree with my findings or interpretations, so please be sure to call me a dumbass in the comments. When going back to 1940s society, you have to remember at this time the concept of flight itself was relatively new. The Wright brothers' plane took off in 1905. Roughly a decade later, they saw their first use in war. It was revolutionary for military minds at the time that they could now attack from a previously untouched sector, the air. Sure, air balloons in war existed, but they were mainly used in an observation capacity. The Great War accelerated military thinkers on how to find a way to best incorporate planes into the military structure. That war saw long, static defensive lines with little or no movement in the front lines. These theorists started to believe planes, and in particular bombers, could be used to shatter the stalemate. World War I ended before bombers and strategic bombing could be used on a large scale. During the interwar years of 1919 to 1939, theories on how to best utilize this new weapon would be a hot topic. Italian airman Giulio Douhet became the father of strategic bombing doctrine. In his writings, he believed that in future wars, land and sea forces would simply fight holding campaigns while the bombers flew in to attack factories and civilian housing, leveling the enemy's industrial capacity and ruining civilian morale. In that scenario, wars would only last a matter of weeks, and it would be all about who had the greater bomber capacity. Theorists like Douhet and the British equivalent Hugh Trenchard acknowledged that there were defenses you could deploy against bombers, like anti-aircraft guns or fighter planes, but those would only have a limited effect, since as the saying went, the bomber will always get through. And once they got through, those bombers would devastate any city. The fear of bomber attacks during the interwar period is similar to today the fear of nuclear missile attack. People believed nothing could be done to stop a nation with a bomber force from using that force to crush a city at any time. That's how revolutionary attacking from the sky was. The best analogy I can really give is, what if today someone created a laser beam that could destroy whole cities from space, basically the Death Star? It would cause panic and anxiety that a new, previously untouched area of warfare was now available. However, during the interwar years, another theory on how planes could best be utilized was being developed. That was tactical air warfare. Instead of the Air Force being independent of ground and sea operation, under this style, bombers and fighters would be used to complement those other arms. The best example of this was in the development of Germany's Air Force. German military leaders during the 1930s found their aircraft industry was too underdeveloped to provide the necessary amount of large, long-range bombers. So they determined to design their air forces around ground support operations. Planes became a key instrument to blitzkrieg, utilizing fast-moving combined arms attacks between tanks, planes, and mechanized infantry in order to strike fast and overwhelm the enemy. British airmen like Trenchard and his American counterpart, Billy Mitchell, did not want to see their air forces put into a subservient role under either the Army or Navy, believing deeply in planes' ability to alter the course of warfare. In World War II, both tactical and strategic uses of planes would be put to the test. Once World War II started in September of 1939, the question of when to strike at the enemy's cities was raised. Neither side wanted to bomb the other cities first, afraid of a retaliation strike back at their own homeland. For Hitler, keeping German cities and the general population sheltered from the negative effects of war was pivotal. He wanted the German population to only see all the good a war could do for them, like bringing in luxury goods. So he did not want to provoke the British or French to start raining down bombs on German cities. However, that reluctance to bomb cities only applied to countries with the capability to bomb him back. Hitler had no problem bombing Warsaw in Poland or Rotterdam in the Netherlands. By summer of 1940, France had surrendered and Hitler was master of Western Europe, with only Great Britain left to oppose him. Because of Churchill and the British people's stubborn resistance not to cave into German pressure and make peace terms that would have been heavily skewed in Germany's favor, German military leaders had to find a way to destroy them. The problem is the English Channel. Hitler cannot get his tanks onto the British islands without control of that passageway. Germany's navy is too small to counter the Royal Navy. but if the Air Force can gain air superiority over Britain, they can get across. Thus begins the Battle of Britain in July of 1940, a purely air battle. At first, the German Air Force focused their attacks on legitimate military targets, like airfields, naval ports, and railway centers, avoiding attacks on city centers. However, as the fight for control of the skies became protracted, German leaders grew increasingly frustrated, looking for any excuse to start attacking British cities. On August 24, 1940, that excuse came. A Luftwaffe bomber crew got lost at night and accidentally bombed East London. The Royal Air Force responded in turn the next night with a raid on Berlin. And like that, Hitler declared the gloves were off. The Luftwaffe would attempt a strategic bombing campaign against British cities from the fall of 1940 into early 1941. However, Germany would execute this with medium-range bombers, since they never developed a long-range strategic bomber. Ultimately, the Luftwaffe failed to gain air superiority over the British air forces, and their bombing campaign failed to break the will of the British people. Germany would now focus their resources east for the Russian invasion, while Britain tried to strike at Germany's heartland. During 1941, the British bombing campaign was mainly focused on Germany's primary industrial sector, the Ruhr region, and was severely ineffective. The number of British airmen lost actually exceeded the number of German civilians killed. The imbalance was because of three main reasons. Number 1, material. The bombers of the RAF were of poor quality at this point. They lacked the speed, range, height, and power to deliver large bomb loads to distant targets. Number 2, geographical. In order to reach Western Germany, bombers had to fly over France, Belgium, or Holland, where the Germans had already begun to deploy a formidable defensive screen of fighters and anti-air guns. And number 3, technological. Since the British did not have long-range fighters to protect their bombers, daylight raids were too costly, so they focused on night attacks. However, Bomber Command lacked the navigational equipment to not just find their designated targets, like factories or power stations, but even to find the cities themselves. An investigation into the effectiveness of British bombing runs found that of the aircraft attacking German targets, only 1 in 4 got within 5 miles. And specifically in the German industrial center of the Ruhr region, that proportion was only 1 in 10. At the end of 1941, a change in strategy felt necessary. The man to lead this change was Arthur "Bomber" Harris. He was a devoted believer in strategic bombing to single-handedly win the war.
That bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
Under his direction, the British would shift from going after precision targets, like factories, and instead focus on what was termed as area bombing. Essentially, you would create a box grid on the map, and then level everything in the box. Arthur's goal was quantity, not quality. He would send massive bomber formations to target a single city, to overwhelm the city's defenses and firefighting capabilities. The ensuing fire would engulf the city and burn it to the ground. That is how they would bring the war home to the German people. As of now, the everyday German citizen has felt no impact of the war. And since the Allies do not have any land armies on the continent, this is their only way to hit Hitler's Germany with an offensive punch. At Harris's disposal is the new Lancaster bomber, which is an excellent nighttime long-range bomber, delivering 4 times more ordnance than the previous generation of bombers, able to deliver an impressive 18,000 pounds of explosives. As well, the Lancaster could fly higher than the older bombers, making it able to avoid ground-based flak guns. Harris would use these beasts on 1,000-plane raids, prioritizing incendiary attacks in the hopes of overwhelming full cities with fire. The first of his 1,000-plane raids was on Cologne in May of 1942 and burned 600 acres. He followed that attack up with raids on Essen and Bremen in June. The British would try to eliminate the industrial Ruhr by burning it to the ground. But by spring of 1942, the British were no longer alone. The Americans had entered the war and were bringing in their own bombing offensive plan based around the powerful B-17 long-range bomber. Against the advice of the British military leaders, the Americans hoped to execute a precision bombing campaign aimed at key German pinpoints. These pinpoints included ball bearing plants, oil refineries, aircraft factories, and U-boat yards. Instead of whole cities like the British plan, the Americans would find specific targets critical to the German war effort and eliminate them. This would mean that American bombers would have to fly during the day so that they could see their targets and attempt to hit them. The B-17 was believed by the Americans to have the capability to fly into enemy territory without fighter escorts, fight their way in, drop their bombs with precision, and then fight their way out and home. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress, equipped with 13 different machine guns. As well, it had the American-made Norden bomb sight, which was said to be able to drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. At the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943, between Churchill and Roosevelt, it was agreed to a two-pronged bombing plan. The British would continue their nighttime area bombing runs, while the Americans focused on daylight attacks on specific targets. The goal was to create a round-the-clock bombing on German targets, preventing the enemy from any rest or reprieve. The US Air Force got to put their B-17s to the test on the ball bearing plant in Schweinfurt, Germany. This factory created the essential component of the gearing shift in aircraft, tanks, and U-boats. So by destroying it, they would be able to cripple German armaments production. That theory was only partially true though. Germany had alternative sources of supply from another plant in Germany, as well as one from neutral Sweden, which lay outside the Allied targeting area. However, even if it was the only source, the raid was a complete disaster. Forced to travel through northern France and half of Germany in daylight without fighter escort, the Flying Fortresses were devastated by fighter attack. Of the 229 B-17s, 36 were shot down, an attrition rate of 16%, more than 3 times higher than the Rate Bomber Command established as acceptable for a single mission. As well, during the complementary raid on Regensburg, 24 more B-17s were shot down. B-17s had to fly in box formations in straight lines in order to support each other, making them easy targets for the agile German fighters. As well, the Norden bomb sight's effectiveness hinged on clear weather. Clouds would ruin visibility of the target, and unfortunately, Europe is a very cloudy place. These factors forced the US to shelve deep penetration missions into Germany. They would not fully resume deep penetration missions into Germany until long-range fighters had been developed. While the American daylight raids were suffering, the British firebombing campaign was achieving big results. In July 1943, they raided the German city of Hamburg and set it ablaze. The inferno reached 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, and after it was all said and done, only 20% of Hamburg's buildings were left, while 30,000 had perished. That wasn't the RAF's only firestorm. They hit Würzburg with 4,000 dead, Darmstadt was 6,000 dead, Heilbronn with 7,000 dead, Wuppertal with 7,000 dead, Wetzlar with 9,000 dead, and Magdeburg with 12,000 dead. These attacks led Harris to ramp it up another notch with the Battle of Berlin. The city of Berlin had been largely untouched by war, and Harris wanted to bring the war home to the German capital. From November 1943 until March 1944, the air battle waged. The results were 6,000 Berliners killed and 1.5 million made homeless. But the loss rate for bombers had climbed over 10% on some missions, well above the acceptable rate of 5%. Those losses, combined with the need for air operations in support of the Allied invasion of France, forced Bomber Harris to discontinue his attacks on Berlin. So how did Germany counter all of these bomber attacks? Other than the well-known direct counters, like fighter interdiction attacks or building enormous flak towers, they had a variety of indirect methods to soften the effect of bombing attacks. For starters, Hitler's armaments minister, Speer, had separated the manufacturing processes and dispersed the fragments into small sites in southern Germany. As well, they created underground factories, built to be impervious to bombing attacks. Finally, they force-imported millions of foreign workers from conquered nations to help increase industrial output. In spring of 1944, the US and British Air Forces were diverted from their strategic missions against German targets to instead focus on tactical assistance for the Allied invasion of France. In support of the actual Normandy landings, the RAF at midnight would bomb coastal batteries in the town of Caen, which was a key town that the German counterattack would have to pass through. Then the US bombers, 1,200 B-17s and B-24s, would bomb for 1/2 hour the defenses at the British beaches of Gold and Sword, as well as the American beach of Omaha. Low-flying B-26s would be used to bomb the defenses at the other American beach, codenamed Utah. If the sky was clear, the bombings would cease 5 minutes before the troops went ashore, and if it was cloudy, 10 minutes. The B-17s struggled in this role. They were designed to pound away at big targets, like oil refineries, and not suited to tactical ground support. Flying at 20,000 feet clouds distorted their view, making bombardiers worried they might launch their payload early and hit friendlies, resulting in most bomb loads being dropped late, landing behind the defensive fortifications. The B-26s had significantly better success. Flying lower at only 500 feet, they were able to inflict heavy damage on German defenses at Utah. In all, the Allies put over 3,400 heavy bombers, over 1,600 medium bombers, and over 5,000 fighters into the air on D-Day. And not one plane was shot down by enemy aircraft. Flak batteries did manage to take out 113 aircraft, though. That level of success and safety was made possible by the Allied bombing campaign in the preceding 2 months before D-Day, where they played the pivotal role in laying the groundwork for the eventual invasion of France. In the spring of 1944, the single most important factor was added to the Allied air forces, the P-51 Mustang. This fighter had an American frame that the British added a Rolls-Royce engine to. With that tweak, the P-51 had an amazing range of 600 miles, making it possible to escort bombers even further than Berlin. Now that any target in Germany could be reached with fighter escorts, daylight bombings could return. Germany's critical industries were pounded. In March of 1944, German oil production was at 316,000 tons. By September, that number was down to only 17,000 tons. Aviation fuel was down to only 5,000 tons. The Luftwaffe was down to its last reserves, effectively grounding their fighters. Rail lines were devastated as well. By the end of December, the number of rail wagons available weekly had fallen from the normal total of 900,000 to only 214,000. In close support of the D-Day operations, the Allied bombing paralyzed the German transportation network in France. On June 6, 1944, French rail traffic was down to 30% of the January figure. That number would further decline to 10% in the weeks after the initial invasion. Bombers and fighters primarily targeted bridges, rail yards, and locomotive repair shops. What rail and transportation network the Germans were able to keep alive could only provide minimal food, fuel, and ammunition. However, those supplies could only be guaranteed to the fighting forces as long as they did not attempt to maneuver. So fragile and inflexible was the network of communication improvised between the Reich and Germany that the troops at the battlefront could depend upon it only if they remained fixed to their positions. Once they moved, there was starvation of essentials. When their fortified perimeter of the beachhead was destroyed by Patton's advance, they could only retreat at the fastest possible speed to the next fortified position with which a communication system connected, and that was the West Wall on the Franco-German border. This all started with the birth of the P-51 Mustang. Because of that fighter, Allied bombers could execute deep penetration missions into Germany and target the critical industries that the Germans could not move, i.e. oil and airfields. By destroying those oil fields, the German Air Force was grounded, and the Allied bombing campaign could focus on destroying the French transportation network, forcing the once mobile German army to be static and stationary. An interesting story to showcase just how dominant the shift in Allied air control was is when Eisenhower's son was driving around the beachhead with his father. He was astonished to see vehicles moving bumper to bumper in complete violation of West Point doctrine. He said, "You'd never get away with this if you didn't have air supremacy." The Supreme Commander responded, "If I didn't have air supremacy, I wouldn't be here." Now that Allied forces were moving toward the German border, the air arm returned to consistently attacking targets within Germany again. At this point in the war, the Allies had not just air superiority, but complete air supremacy. The difference is that air superiority means being able to conduct air operations without difficult interference by the opposing force, while air supremacy goes even further, where the opposing air force is completely incapable of any effective interference. That level of dominance led to the destruction of every target of military value within Germany. With those destroyed, it was on to raids aimed at destroying civilian morale. In February of 1945, the Allied bombers flattened Nuremberg. Then, 2 nights later, it was Pforzheim's turn. Berlin was even targeted on March 3rd in a daylight raid, showing just how far Allied air forces had come. Cities like Dortmund, Würzburg, and Potsdam were also targeted in 1945, but no attack was more famous than the one on the German historic city of Dresden on February 13th and 14th, 1945. 1,300 British and American bombers appeared in successive waves, raining down incendiaries and high explosives, engulfing the city in a wall of fire. In all, almost 4,000 tons of ordnance had been dropped on the city, with roughly between 25,000 and 100,000 left dead, making this one of the more controversial episodes of World War II, since the city did not produce anything of military value. The overall cost of strategic bombing was extremely high. Altogether, some 600,000 German civilians died from bombing attacks. The Allied bomber crews also suffered. Over 158,000 American and British aircrew lives were lost, and over 40,000 combat aircraft were destroyed. And in the end, the pre-war expectations were wrong. The strategic bombing offensive didn't break Germany's will, and was unable to single-handedly win the war. That brings us to the key question. Was it worth it? Did the Allied strategic bombing campaign achieve the objective of helping to win the war? As well, was it justified to pulverize whole cities as they did? Let's first dive into the effectiveness of the Allied bombing campaign. Sure, it didn't single-handedly win the war, but that doesn't mean it was an abject failure. Despite the fact that strategic bombing did not produce a decisive victory over Germany, it was a decisive factor in the defeat of Germany. Take oil, for example. Oil is the most important resource for any modern army. Without it, your tanks, planes, and transport vehicles simply cannot move. Even infantry rely on oil, since that is how food and provisions can be transported to the front lines. The combined bomber offensive eliminated Germany's oil capacity. As a direct result of attacks on the oil industry, production declined from the peak of 316,000 tons per month to 17,000 tons by September 1944. Furthermore, attacks during 1944 reduced aviation gas supplies from 175,000 tons in April to 30,000 tons in June, and further to 5,000 tons in September. Albert Speer reported to Hitler in his monthly report, "The enemy has succeeded in increasing our losses of aviation gasoline up to 90% by June 22, 1944. A specific example is the Leuna synthetic oil plant, which was the largest plant in the Reich, and the bombing offensive rendered it completely ineffective for production. Bomber attacks from May through December 1944 resulted in an average production of only 9% of its total capacity. The elimination of oil plants like Leuna grounded the Luftwaffe. The Germans had 815 fighters available to fly on D-Day, but only flew 100 sorties. This was due to a lack of oil. The large number of weapons employed and concentrated on this single target set devastated Germany's synthetic oil production, to the point where it could no longer effectively support the war effort. Critics will argue, though, that the bomber offensive was not effective because production generally increased throughout the war. Now, this is partially correct, but when examined in the proper context, this increase in production does not disprove the effectiveness of the strategic bombing initiative. It is a fact that German production did increase through the war, but the German industries did not start the war operating at 100% capacity, and the combined bomber offensive actually prevented them from reaching max capacity. German industry did not really start to mobilize for war until the German army suffered their defeat near Moscow. The Allied bomber attacks on German industries, which caused them to disperse their resources, hampered the efforts of the German industry to expand and mobilize. There are several examples of this stifled growth. In 1943, Germany produced over 24,000 aircraft, and in 1944, it produced over 39,000 aircraft. However, Germany planned to produce 80,000 aircraft in 1944, but could not due to the effects of bombing. In September 1944, fighter production was only 45% of the pre-combined bomber offensive production capacity. Therefore, Germany only increased production because it did not mobilize their industries for war until late in the war. And by then, the combined bomber offensive created a ceiling on that growth. The strategic bombing ceiling prevented Germany from surviving the attrition-based warfare they became engaged in. The combined bomber offensive attacks on synthetic oil also had a ripple effect that is seldom discussed. Nitrogen is a resource that depended on synthetic oil. Before 1944, the German industry produced 75,000 tons of nitrogen per month. Due to lack of synthetic oil, production fell to less than 20,000 tons per month by the end of 1944. Shells used nitrogen as an explosive, and the German agriculture industry also used nitrogen. However, the nitrogen allocation for agriculture use dropped from 54% during 1943 to 0% during 1944. Despite the reallocation of nitrogen from the agricultural sector, industrial supplies for explosives still ran out. Anti-aircraft shells contained partial fills of explosives. German armies suffered severe ammunition shortages. The synthetic rubber industry also depended on oil. The effects of attacks on the oil industry rippled through the synthetic rubber industry. The Reich depended on 4 different plants to provide rubber for the war effort. Each of the plants operated on synthetic oil from a plant in the Ruhr region. At its peak, the rubber industry produced 2,000 tons a month, but that production dropped to 1/6 as a result of the attacks on oil by bombers. The coal industry is another resource Germany could not live without, since that was their main power source for their industrial sector. The bombing drastically affected Germany's transportation network. Since railways and marshalling yards were destroyed, that limited the movement of coal throughout the country. From October 1944 until February 1945, German coal reserves fell from 18 days to 4.5 days. Attacks on the Cologne Bridge resulted in the interdiction of all water movements of coal to southern Germany. As well, attacks against the rail industry reduced the number of cars carrying coal from 21,000 per day in early 1944 to just 9,000 in early 1945. The attacks were so devastating that even locomotives lacked the coal to run, much less transport it around the country. The coal industry suffered not because of direct attacks, it suffered due to secondary effects from the attacks on railways and waterways. Finally, one of the biggest consequences of the bombing offensive was the diversion of resources. Germany had to divert massive amounts of men and material to combat these attacks. Men and material that would have been vital to the German frontline efforts. Over 2 million soldiers and citizens provided anti-aircraft defense. That is more personnel than what worked in the entire aircraft industry. As well, another 1 million people engaged in repair and rebuilding of damaged facilities. Large amounts of war materials were diverted to defend against bomber attacks. 30% of all guns and 20% of all heavy munitions went directly to defending the homeland. The homeland had as many guns defending it as the troops on the entire Eastern Front had. An example to showcase just how mammoth the material commitment required for home defense was is the fact that estimates showed that it took approximately 16,000 shells to bring down just one bomber. Instead of being able to commit to building armaments to fight land battles, Germany had to divert critical amounts to defend the skies. Okay, so materially, the bombing offensive did have direct and indirect impacts on the German war effort. But was the continual fire bombings of cities with no military value really worth it? Did the Allies lose their soul by taking the war to such extreme lengths? Well, to rationalize that, you must remember that the Allied commanders did not know what the results of the strategic bombing campaign were going to be. No one had ever used bombers in large scale in warfare before. They were relying on the precedent set by the Russian Revolution in 1917, which knocked Russia out of World War I. They genuinely believed they could recreate those same kinds of conditions in Germany, which would lead to revolution and ultimately to our downfall. But at the end of the day, the simplest explanation is that the Allies felt that any measure to shorten the war was worth the risk. And that is really what we should focus on when studying strategic bombing. Instead of using hindsight, we must analyze the decisions made by Allied military leaders based on the information they had at the time, and not what we know from the comfort of now. They were committed to a war against one of the greatest military regimes ever assembled. How could you not justify using every weapon and tactic at your disposal in the hope of defeating the enemy and shortening the war? That is why, in my opinion, not only was the bombing campaign justified for its effects on the German war machine, but also from a moral perspective.